The wind came off the ridge like something with a grudge. It moved through the gaps in the old barn walls, found every weakness in the timber, and made sounds that had no business being made by wood and nails. Daniel Hart stood 30 feet from the structure, with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath fogging in the December air, and he did what he always did when he looked at a failing building. He counted what couldn't be saved. The east wall leaned 2 degrees off plumb, maybe 3. The roofline sagged in the middle like a man who'd been carrying weight too long. Ice had worked its way under the shingles. He could see the telltale buckle from here, and the foundation stones on the north side had heaved with the frost. The whole thing sat on the hillside like it was deciding whether to stay or go. Asterisk. This won't take long, Daniel thought. He'd driven 40 minutes from town at the request of a woman he'd never met, who had left a voicemail that was careful and precise, the voice of someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say. He'd almost called back to cancel. He'd done enough of these in the past 2 years to recognize the shape of them. A property in trouble, an owner holding on past the point of reason, a conversation that ended with him delivering news nobody wanted to hear. The snow was ankle-deep in the field. The farmhouse at the far end of the drive had warm light in one window. He was still cataloging damage, the broken cupola, the missing boards along the gable end, when the farmhouse door opened and a woman walked out toward him through the snow. Even from a distance, he could tell she was cold and not showing it. She moved like someone who had decided not to let the weather win today. Then she stopped a few feet from him, looked up, and asked, her voice steady but something small and careful underneath it. "Times, are you married?" Asterisk. Daniel didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, Clara Whitmore went still. The question had been hers, but the silence that followed belonged to both of them. Daniel Hart had a reputation in Alder Ridge that served him well and cost him occasionally. He was the man you called when you wanted the truth about a structure. Not comfort. Not a contractor who'd take your money and string the job out over 2 seasons while the problems compounded. Daniel would walk through a property, spend 2 hours with a flashlight and a moisture meter and a pry bar, and then sit down at your kitchen table and tell you exactly what was there. If it could be fixed, he'd say so and tell you what it would cost. If it couldn't, or if the cost outweighed the value, he'd say that too. And he wouldn't dress it up. Word had gotten around that he was blunt, also that he was honest. In a region where those two things weren't always bundled together, people drove from neighboring counties to have him look at their properties. He was 38 years old. He'd been doing this since he was 22, first as an apprentice to his uncle, then on his own after the old man retired. He knew timber framing and poured concrete and block masonry and the particular ways that old farmhouses in cold climates failed over time. He knew which problems were cosmetic and which ones were structural. He knew how to read a foundation the way other men read a newspaper. What he'd never gotten good at, in all those years, was delivering the verdict when the owner really needed the answer to be different. He'd learned to do it cleanly. Say it once, say it clearly, don't hedge. Let them sit with it. Answer questions if they had them. That was the kindest version of a hard thing, and it was the version he'd trained himself to deliver. His daughter, Lily, was 8 years old and understood, with the uncanny precision of children, that her father's work made him sad sometimes. Not the buildings themselves, she knew he loved those, but the conversations at the end. The part where he drove home, quieter than usual. "Did you have to tell someone no today?" she'd ask, from the back seat, not looking up from whatever book she was carrying. "Yeah," he'd say. "Was it bad?" "Wasn't great." And she'd nod like that was sufficient, and they'd drive the rest of the way in silence that was comfortable rather than empty. They were good at that kind of silence. It had been their main language for most of the last 4 years, since Rachel died on a Tuesday in March on a 2-lane highway outside of town, in conditions that the weather report had called times minor accumulation, asterisk. Daniel had not remarried. Had not dated. Had not, as far as he could tell, done much of anything except raise his daughter and go to work and come home. The people who knew him well had stopped trying to set him up around the 18-month mark, when it became clear that the polite deflections were not going to soften into openness. He wasn't cold, he was present and attentive with Lily. Warm with old friends, generous with his time when a neighbor needed something. He just had a wall around a specific part of himself, and it was well built, and he maintained it carefully, and it showed no signs of coming down. Alder Ridge was the kind of place where December came in fast and mean and stayed until it was ready to leave. By the third week of the month, the fields had been under snow for 2 weeks, and the temperature hadn't climbed above 20 since Thanksgiving. The farms on the north side of the ridge, the Whitmore property among them, faced the worst of it, buffered from the rest of town by the angle of the hill. He'd gotten the voicemail on a Wednesday evening. Clara Whitmore, calling about a barn structure on her family's property. She described it in careful terms. Original construction from the 1940s, timber frame, approximately 40 by 60 feet. She said she understood it needed substantial work. She said she wasn't asking for miracles. She'd said Times, please it Weiss in the span of a 90-second message, which told him something, though he wasn't yet sure what. He'd driven out on Friday morning, early, before Lily needed to be at school. He'd planned to be back in 2 hours. He'd told himself this was a quick one. Standing in the snow, looking at the structure, he was still telling himself that. The barn listed slightly, almost imperceptibly to the northwest. The main doors had swollen in their frames, and someone had left them forced halfway open, which meant wind and snow had been getting in for weeks at minimum. The cupola was gone, which meant the ridgeline had compromised. One of the main support posts along the south wall had cracked, probably under ice load, and been poorly sistered with a piece of dimensional lumber that wasn't rated for the job. He wrote notes in the small spiral notebook he kept in his breast pocket. His handwriting was compact and angular, and he filled half a page in 5 minutes. Asterisk. This won't take long, he thought again. Clara Whitmore came across the snowfield with a stride that suggested she had somewhere more important to be, even though she was clearly walking toward him. She was somewhere in her mid-30s. She wore a dark green coat that had seen better winters, work boots, and no hat, which struck him as either confidence or stubbornness, he couldn't tell which yet. Her hair was the color of autumn wheat, and the wind was doing what it liked with it. She stopped a few feet away, looked at his face, then at his notebook. "You've already decided," she said. It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't quite an accusation either. It was the statement of a person who was good at reading situations and had gotten good at it out of necessity. "I've started forming an opinion," Daniel said carefully. "I haven't heard what you need yet." She glanced at the barn, then back at him. "What I need is for someone to tell me it's possible. Possible is a big category." "I know." She walked toward the barn and he followed, and as they pushed through the frozen open doors, he asked her to tell him about the property. She did. She was organized about it. The way someone is organized when they've rehearsed the telling because they know they won't have much time. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She'd grown up on the property, left for college, spent her 20s in the Pacific Northwest working in agricultural management, and come back 3 years ago when her father's health began declining. Her mother had passed when Clara was 19. Her father, she paused here, briefly. The first crack in the efficiency, her father had died in September. He'd left her the farm. He'd also left her a situation. The property had been mortgaged twice during the years Clara was away, the second time to fund a renovation project on the main house that her father had started but not finished. There was a payment schedule. There was a bank in Millhaven that was not unkind but was not sentimental, and they had been in contact about the outstanding balance and the fact that the collateral, meaning the structures, meaning primarily the barn, had deteriorated beyond what they'd assessed at the time of the second loan. 30 days. That was the phrase she used. The bank would be sending an assessor in 30 days, and if the primary structure was still in its current condition, they would have sufficient grounds to accelerate the foreclosure process. While she talked, Daniel moved through the interior. He kept his flashlight moving along the walls, checking the mortise and tenon joints where the main posts met the beams. What he found was not good. The northeast corner post had rot in the base punky wood, soft under his thumbnail. The main purlin along the east side had a crack that someone had filled with caulk at some point, which was approximately as useful as putting a bandage on a broken leg. The floor was earthen but not level, which suggested the foundation had shifted significantly in multiple cycles of frost heave. He didn't say any of this while she talked. He listened and looked. When she finished, she said, "My father wanted to make this a working stable. Small scale. 6 to 8 horses. He had plans drawn up years ago. He wanted to add a community space on the east end, a place where people from town could rent arena time, take lessons. He thought the valley needed something like that." She reached into her coat and produced a folded document. She held it out to him. He took it carefully. The paper was old yellowed at the folds, soft with age. The drawings were hand-drafted, done with care. He could see the floor plan, the elevation sketches, the notation about beam sizing. Whoever had drawn these had known what they were doing. He stood in the middle of the barn, holding a dead man's dream, and for a moment he didn't say anything. "He never got to start it," Clara said. Her voice was level. He always thought there would be more time. Daniel folded the plans carefully and handed them back. He looked at the roof. He looked at the corner post. He looked at the crack in the purlin. "I need to take some more measurements," he said. Lily Hart had opinions about buildings. This had started when she was 5, and Daniel had taken her to a job site, a farmhouse restoration, nothing dangerous, and she'd walked through every room asking questions he'd had to look up later to answer properly. Why did the walls bow out here? Why was this floor lower than that one? Why did the stairs feel wobbly when you stood at the bottom but not the top? The questions had been genuine good questions, and he'd told her so, and that had set something in motion that had not stopped. By the time she was 7, she had opinions about foundation drainage. She'd actually read a picture book about how bridges were built and had then asked him for a more advanced one, which he'd found at the county library, and which she'd returned, dog-eared and annotated in the margins, in her looping 8-year-old handwriting. He brought her back to the Whitmore property the next morning, a Saturday, partly because he had questions he needed to answer before he could decide what to tell Clara, and partly because Lily had no school and his usual arrangement for weekend mornings, his neighbor Mrs. Peterson, watching her, had fallen through. Lily wore her red coat and her serious expression and said nothing for the first 10 minutes, which meant she was thinking. The snow had gotten an inch deeper overnight. The barn looked the same, which was to say it looked like something that had decided to give up and was now just negotiating the terms of its surrender. Daniel walked the perimeter again, noting the foundation stones, checking where the sill plate met the bottom course. He pressed his thumbnail into wood in several places. He took photographs. He measured the deflection in the roofline with a string line and found it was worse than he'd estimated. 6 inches of sag over 40 feet, which was significant. Lily stood at the main entrance and looked up. "The roof is the problem," she said. "Part of the problem. If the roof wasn't pushing down on everything, would the posts be okay?" He stopped and looked at her. "What do you mean?" She pointed. Her 8-year-old finger traced the line of the purlin. "The crack is at the top of the post, not the bottom. So maybe the post isn't the thing that broke. Maybe the roof got heavy and pushed down, and that's what cracked it." He stood very still for a moment. She wasn't wrong. He'd been looking at the crack in the post as a symptom of post-failure rot, overloading from below. But she'd identified something he hadn't fully articulated yet. The direction of force. The crack propagated downward from the beam seat. That was consistent with the roof load exceeding what the joint was designed for, not with the post failing independently, which meant the post itself might still have structural integrity, which meant if you dealt with the roof load problem first, you might be able to save more than he'd initially calculated. He started rerunning numbers in his head. "You're not wrong," he said. Lily shrugged, like this was not surprising information. Clara came out of the farmhouse 20 minutes later with 2 mugs of coffee and a cup of hot chocolate, which she handed to Lily with a seriousness that Lily matched exactly. He watched Clara crouch down slightly to Lily's eye level and ask her what she thought of the building, and watched Lily explain her theory about the roof load, and watched Clara listen the way adults rarely listen to children completely, without the slight condescension that usually came with the attention. "That's a good observation," Clara said. "My dad thinks so too," Lily said, but he didn't say it first. Clara looked at Daniel over the rim of her coffee mug, and something in her expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but the beginning of it, the thawing edge. He looked at his notes, looked at the barn, and said the thing he'd resisted saying since yesterday. "It's possible. It'll be hard and it'll be expensive, and there are no guarantees with a structure this old in this condition. But it's possible." Clara didn't move. She held her coffee mug with both hands and looked at the barn and then at the folded plans in her coat pocket and then at nothing in particular. "Okay," she said, finally. "Tell me what it takes." The work started on a Monday, and by Wednesday Daniel had stopped pretending this was a standard job. Standard jobs had clear scope and reasonable timelines, and clients who stayed in the house and made themselves available for questions. This was none of those things. The scope expanded every time he opened a wall cavity and found something new to contend with. The timeline was compressed by the bank's deadline and by the weather, which had opinions about the project that it expressed through wind and fresh snowfall, and temperatures that made the wood so cold it could crack when you drove a nail wrong. Clara did not stay in the house. She was there every morning before he arrived, and she was still there when he left in the evenings, and she worked. Not in a performative way, not in the way of someone who wanted credit for effort. She worked because there was work to do, and she'd assessed what she was capable of doing, and she did those things steadily and without complaint. She turned out to be good with a nail gun. She'd learned to frame during a period in her 20s when she'd worked on a sustainable construction project in Oregon, and the knowledge had stayed with her. She couldn't do the structural calculations, she knew that, and didn't pretend otherwise, but she could execute. She could read a measurement and cut a board and know when a joint was square and when it wasn't. Daniel found himself recalibrating. He'd built a model of her in his head from the phone voicemail and the first conversation. A person in crisis, determined but over her head, likely to need managing. He revised this model by the end of the first week. She didn't need managing. She needed resources and she needed the technical knowledge he carried. And beyond those things, she was handling the situation better than most people handled situations with half the stakes. The crew he'd called in 2 men he worked with regularly. Owen Marsh and Pete Galloway had taken her measure in the first hour and treated her like a colleague afterward, which was its own kind of assessment. The roofline was the first priority. They stripped the failed shingles, sistered the damaged rafters, replaced 2 that were beyond saving. The ice-damaged sheathing came off in sections and went into a pile by the fence line. New OSB went up, then underlayment, then steel roofing panels that Clara had sourced from a supplier in Millhaven, at a price that was, Daniel suspected, better than he could have gotten on his own. He asked her about it once. "I grew up in agricultural management," she said, without looking up from the sheet she was marking. "Suppliers remember you when you've been placing orders for 10 years. That's a useful thing to be," he said. "It's a useful thing to times have been, asterisk," she said. "I'm still figuring out what I am now." He didn't press it. He recognized the shape of that statement, the past tense, doing heavy lifting, and left it alone. Lily came on weekends and sat in the corner with her book and her hot chocolate and offered observations when she had them, which was more often than most adults might expect. She and Clara had established a rapport that Daniel watched with a combination of gratitude and something more complicated that he chose not to examine too closely. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks in, they'd made real progress. The roof was done. The northeast corner post had been examined, found to be sounder than feared, and reinforced. Two of the main floor joists, added in a later renovation, not original to the structure, had been sistered and were solid now. Then the storm came. It rolled in from the northwest at around 2 in the morning. A real storm, the kind the ridge was known for. Daniel's phone woke him at 4 with a text from Owen. Asterisk. You need to see the south end. Asterisk. The new roofing had held. The old east wall connection, a place he'd flagged as secondary priority, intending to get to it in the final week, had not. 8 feet of wall had peeled away from the main frame, taking 2 original vertical planks with it. Snow had poured in through the gap, and the floor was covered in 6 inches of it, packed and dense, and the nearest beam showed stress fractures from the sudden lateral load. Daniel stood in the dark barn with his flashlight and his notebook and his coffee going cold in his hand, and he looked at it for a long time. Clara arrived 20 minutes later, still in her coat over pajamas, her hair pushed back, her face showing nothing useful except that she was awake and present. She looked at it. She looked at him. Can we still make the deadline? She asked. He did the math in his head. Supplies on order, crew availability, the damage itself. Maybe, he said. But we need help. The storm knocked out the power to the farmhouse for 2 days, and Daniel lent Clara a generator he kept in his truck for job sites, and that was how he ended up eating dinner in her kitchen on a Wednesday night in January, with a single work light on the table and the sound of the generator humming outside. They were eating soup that Clara had made from things she had in the pantry, not because it was a gesture, but because it was practical, because the stove ran on propane and they'd both been working since before sunrise, and they needed to eat, and the soup was there. Lily was at Daniel's neighbor's house for the night. He'd arranged it that morning when it became clear the day was going to run long. It was the first time in 3 weeks he'd sat down in this kitchen without a plan spread across the table. There was no plan now. There was just the soup and the light and the snow pressing against the windows. Clara asked him how he'd started doing restoration work. He told her. His uncle, the apprenticeship, the way he'd discovered that old buildings were more interesting than new ones because they contained decisions that people had made generations ago, and you had to understand the decision in order to understand the problem. She listened in the particular way she had, which was complete and unhurried. Then she asked him how long he'd been doing the work on his own, and he told her a version of it time since my uncle retired, about 14 years that was true but not complete, and she seemed to understand that because she didn't push. She moved on to a question about the barn's original framing technique, which he answered, and they talked about that for a while. But then the conversation quieted down, and the generator hummed, and she said carefully, like someone stepping onto ice they weren't sure would hold, "You and Lily." "Is it just the 2 of you?" "It is," he said. A pause. "For how long?" He looked at the table. 4 years. She didn't ask what had happened. Most people asked what had happened. He developed a routine answer times an accident, a car accident, icy road that he delivered in a way that closed the subject gently. He prepared it now, out of habit. But she said, "I'm sorry." And that was all. And the fact that it was all made him add something he hadn't planned. Her name was Rachel, he said. She had this way of making everyone in a room feel like the most important person in it. Lily has some of that particular quality. He stopped. Clara waited, not filling the silence. "It was a Tuesday," he said, "which I know doesn't mean anything, but I remember that. Tuesday morning. Lily was at school. I was already at a job site. A breath. I had a voicemail from Rachel from 8 that morning. She was calling to ask me something about whether we needed milk, and I didn't listen to it until 2 days later. Because I couldn't. He hadn't told anyone that part. Not that precisely." He looked up, half expecting to find pity on her face, which he would have navigated carefully, or the slight uncomfortable brightness people got when they didn't know how to respond to grief. Instead, he found something quieter. Recognition, maybe. "My mother died when I was 19, she said. It was the middle of sophomore year. I went back to school after 2 weeks because I didn't know what else to do. Did it help? No, she said simply. But it gave me somewhere to put my body while the rest of me figured things out. He looked at her across the table, and something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. Just a slight rearrangement of how the room felt. I've gotten good at keeping things small, he said. My life, I mean. Just Lily and the work. It felt like the right size. And now, he didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he had an answer that he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. He picked up his spoon and they went back to the soup, and neither of them pushed it further, and the generator kept humming in the dark outside. It was the following Friday evening when Clara asked the question that had been waiting in the room for weeks. They'd had a good day, a genuinely good one, the kind that comes when everything goes right and you end the afternoon with more done than you'd planned. The east wall was fully reframed. The corner connection that had failed in the storm was rebuilt, this time with hardware rated for the load. The interior space had been cleaned out and dried, and for the first time, Daniel could walk through the barn without cataloging what was wrong with it. He'd sent Owen and Pete home at 4. He'd stayed to take final measurements on the north wall, which was the last major section remaining. Clara had brought out coffee, and they'd stood in the barn in the late afternoon light, that cold, gold light that winter sometimes produced in the last hour before dark, and looked at what they'd built. It was something. He was surprised by how much it was something. They'd gone back to the farmhouse as the light failed, and she'd made tea, and he'd meant to leave an hour earlier, but the conversation had gone somewhere and then somewhere else, and now it was 8 o'clock and they were sitting at the kitchen table again, with the maps of the barn spread out and the tea gone cold. She was reading the notes he'd made about the final section. He was looking at his notebook. The kitchen was warm. Outside, snow was falling again, not storm snow, just the ordinary quiet kind, flake by flake out of a dark sky. He was aware of how the room felt. He'd been aware of it for a while, and he'd been managing the awareness the way he managed most things carefully, at a distance. Then she looked up from the notes, and something in her face had shifted. She looked like a person who had decided to ask something and was regretting the decision slightly but was going to go ahead anyway. Daniel. Yeah. A pause. Are you married? He looked at her. The question was careful. But it wasn't a small question, not from her, not in this kitchen, not after 3 weeks of working side by side in the cold and eating soup by generator light and telling each other things they hadn't told other people. He held the question for a moment. No, he said. Then, slowly. But I'm still someone's father, and for a long time I thought that was all the room there was. In here. He touched his chest once, briefly. I thought I'd just run out of space, for anything new. Clara didn't respond right away. She set the notes down. She looked at the table. The clock on the wall moved. The snow fell outside. She stayed completely still, like a person who had heard something and needed a moment to determine what it meant. Daniel watched her and said nothing, because the silence felt like it was hers to hold. Clara became quieter in the days that followed, not cold, not unfriendly. She was still there every morning, still working, still asking good questions and executing cleanly and keeping the same pace she'd maintained throughout. But there was a reserve in her now that hadn't been there before. A small distance she maintained in the spaces where they'd previously been easy with each other. Daniel told himself he'd misread the room, that the question had been practical times. Are you available? Is there someone who'll object to the time you're spending here? And that his answer, which had wandered somewhere more personal than she'd intended, had been awkward. He told himself the distance was her polite way of resetting to a professional register, which was reasonable, which was probably the right call. He told himself this for 3 days. Lily was at the farm on the Saturday after the question. She was in her usual corner with her current book, a library copy about the physics of structures that she'd found herself and checked out without prompting, and she'd been watching Clara with the patient attention she sometimes gave to things she was trying to understand. Around 11 in the morning, when Daniel was in the north corner rechecking his measurements and Clara was organizing hardware supplies near the main doors, Lily got up and walked over to Clara. Daniel heard this without looking up, because he recognized the particular sound of Lily deciding to say something. "Are you okay?" Lily asked. A pause. "I'm fine," Clara said. "Thank you, Lily. You look like you're thinking about something hard." Another pause longer. "Maybe," Clara said. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, in the straightforward way she had that Daniel could never quite prepare for. "Do you like us? Me and my dad?" He stopped writing. "Yes," Clara said, and her voice had changed slightly softer. "I really do." "Then how come you're acting like we're leaving soon?" He heard the soft exhale of someone who hadn't expected to be seen that clearly. He kept his eyes on his notebook. Clara said, "I've lost people before, Lily. When I get attached to something or someone, I start worrying about losing it. So sometimes I push back a little bit, just to prepare for it." "Does that make sense?" Lily appeared to consider this. "Kind of," she said. "But that seems like a hard way to live." "It is," Clara said quietly. "It really is." He looked up then. He couldn't help it. Clara was crouching down slightly, level with Lily, and Lily had her book against her chest and was looking at Clara with the complete attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to learn. "We're not going anywhere," Lily said. "My dad likes it here. He's different here." "Different how?" Clara asked. "Less quiet," Lily said. The bank's assessor was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 3 days out. What they had left was significant, but not insurmountable. The north wall connection points, the interior loft framing that Clara's father had planned as a viewing area for the arena, and the final inspection of the main beam system, a check Daniel wanted to do himself. With everything else in place, to confirm the load path was clean all the way through. On the Monday before the assessment, Owen Marsh came in with his brother-in-law unannounced, carrying a truck bed full of rough-cut lumber that Owen said he'd gotten from a mill north of town at cost. He didn't explain why exactly, just set the lumber down and got to work, and Daniel wasn't inclined to question it. By Tuesday afternoon, it had grown. Ted Calloway from the feed store brought insulation bats and a heat gun, and his oldest son, who was 17 and strong and who spent 2 days running materials without being asked. Margaret Hooper, who ran the small engine repair shop on Route 9, arrived with a trailer full of tools she said Daniel could use and didn't need back until spring. The Aldridge brothers, Frank and Dennis, who farmed 2 properties east of the Whitmore land, came with chainsaws and helped clear the debris pile that had been accumulating along the fence line. Daniel watched this happen with the feeling of a man whose life has gone somewhere he didn't plan. He had been part of this community for almost 15 years. He'd done work for most of these people, or their neighbors, or their parents. He'd eaten at these tables and borrowed these tools before. He understood that this was what small places did for each other, but he hadn't asked for this. No one had, as far as he knew. He found Owen at the end of the second day and asked him who'd made the calls. Owen gave him a look that was not quite innocent. "Clara grew up here," he said. "People remember. She's been gone for years. Her father wasn't," Owen said, "and she came back when he needed her." People notice those things. Daniel thought about this on the drive home. He thought about what it took to build the kind of credit that made people show up with truck beds of lumber and heat guns on a Tuesday in January. He thought about what it said about a person. He was parked in his driveway before he finished thinking about it. And even then, he wasn't sure he'd arrived at anything. Just that the picture of Clara Whitmore he was carrying in his head was more complicated and more complete than the one he'd walked up to in a snowy field 3 weeks earlier. He went inside and made dinner and sat at the table with Lily and helped with her homework. And the evening was ordinary. And he let it be ordinary. But late that night, when the house was quiet and Lily was asleep, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked at the wall for a while. Asterisk. This is not just a job anymore, he thought. He'd known that for some time. He'd been choosing not to say it, even to himself, because the moment you said a thing like that, it required a response. He sat with it now. Let it be said, the assessment went clean. The bank's man was a careful, unhurried individual named Gerald Spence, who had been doing structural assessments for 22 years, and was not easily impressed and was not easily fooled. He spent 3 hours in and around the barn with his own flashlight and his own notebook. And Daniel walked with him and answered questions and did not offer opinions unless asked. At the end of the 3 hours, Gerald Spence stood in the center of the main floor and looked up at the beam system and was quiet for a moment. Original mortise and tenon, he said. Most of it, Daniel said. Some of the connections were replaced. I can show you the documentation. The load path is clean, end to end. Gerald Spence made a note. He went outside and looked at the foundation stones one more time. This is considerably better than our last assessment, he said, which was the most enthusiasm Daniel suspected the man was capable of. Clara was at the farmhouse, waiting. She hadn't been in the barn during the assessment. Daniel had suggested it, and she'd agreed, recognizing that the evaluator needed neutral space. Daniel walked back across the snow to the house and found her at the kitchen table with a glass of water she wasn't drinking, turned to face the door. He told her what Gerald had said. She held perfectly still for 2 seconds. Then she set the glass down, put both hands flat on the table, and exhaled slowly through her nose in a way that seemed to release something she'd been holding for a very long time. The extension? She asked. He indicated it should be straightforward. He'll have the paperwork to the bank by Monday. She nodded. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and she said, I don't know how to. You don't need to, he said. Daniel, Clara. She looked at him for a moment, and then something in her face shifted in a way that he recognized it was the expression of a person deciding to stop managing a feeling and just let it exist. He sat down across from her. The kitchen was warm. The snow outside was the quiet kind. Just there, just falling. I said something to you, he said. A few weeks ago. About not having room. I remember. I think I said it wrong. He paused, finding the shape of what he wanted to say. Or I said it accurately for how things were, but not for how they are now. Which is a different thing. She waited. I don't know what I'm saying exactly, he admitted. I've been out of practice for a long time. I think Lily would tell you I've been out of practice. A small, real smile crossed Clara's face. She actually might. What I'm trying to say is that I walked onto this property 30 days ago thinking I was going to be here for 2 hours and deliver bad news and drive away. And instead, he stopped. Started again. Something changed. I don't know how to describe it better than that. Something changed. The quiet stretched out, but it wasn't empty. It was the quiet of something settling into place. I'm scared, Clara said, simply. I know, I am too. I'm not very good at this. At letting people? Neither am I, he said. Outside, a gust moved through the yard, and the snow shifted and resettled. The generator had been turned off the previous week when the power came back, and the house was making its own sounds now, the tick of the radiator, the small voice of the wind at the eaves. Okay, Clara said finally, quietly, like a person accepting a difficult thing. It was enough. For now, it was entirely enough. By mid-February, the barn had a name. It was Lily's doing. She'd made an executive decision, Daniel's phrase, delivered dryly that a place this significant needed to be called something, and she'd proposed times the Ridge stable with the confidence of an 8-year-old who has thought about this for several days and considers the matter settled. Clara had agreed immediately. Daniel had pretended to deliberate and then agreed, because the name was good and also because Lily deserved the win. The first horses arrived on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of February, a bay mare named Cleo and a gray gelding named Frost, both on 30-day trial lease from a breeder outside Millhaven. who Clara had worked with years before and who'd given her a favorable arrangement because she'd asked for one, and she was good at asking for things she'd earned. Lily stood at the fence in her red coat and watched the horses come off the trailer with the total absorbed concentration that she gave to things she considered important, which was most things. Frost came close to the fence and blew his breath in her direction, and she held out her hand, flat, the way Daniel had shown her, and the horse accepted the gesture with dignity. "He likes me," she announced. "He's deciding," Daniel said. "He likes me," she said again, with certainty. Clara had come out of the house and was standing slightly behind them, and Daniel heard her laugh. Not a polite laugh, but a real one, surprised out of her by the moment, and the sound of it was something he wanted to hold on to. The community space on the East End was not finished yet. That was spring work. After the ground thawed, but it existed in the plans now, revised and updated from her father's original drawings, with some modifications that Daniel had suggested and Clara had approved, and that the two of them had spent 3 evenings working on together at the kitchen table, with the plans spread out and tea going cold. Owen Marsh had agreed to bring his crew back in April to do the framing. Margaret Hooper's son had offered to do the electrical. The Aldridge brothers had said they'd donate the first cord of firewood for the community fire pit that was part of the East End design. This was how things worked in a place like Alder Ridge, when a thing was worth working for. The February sun was thin, but it was there, angling off the snow in a way that didn't have the bite of December. The light was longer now, barely perceptibly, but Daniel had been living in this place his whole life, and he noticed. He stood at the fence with Lily and Clara on either side of him, watching the horses settle into their new pasture, and he thought about the version of himself that had driven up this road 2 months ago, expecting to deliver a verdict and leave. He thought about what that man had decided, somewhere along the way, without fully meaning to. The decision had not arrived as a revelation. It had arrived the way most real things arrived, incrementally, through accumulated evidence, through small moments that added up to something he could no longer argue against. He'd stopped arguing against it around the time of the soup in the dark kitchen, if he was being honest. Or maybe before that, when Clara had crouched down and listened to Lily's theory about the roof load. Or maybe when she'd said, "Times I'm scared," simply, without performance, and looked at him and waited to see what he did with that. He'd done something with it. They both had. He wasn't entirely sure what to call it yet, but it was there, and it was built on honest materials, and it seemed like it might hold. Lily leaned against the fence and looked up at him. Her expression was the one she got when she already knew something and was waiting for the adult to catch up. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, in the voice that meant times everything. Spring came to Alder Ridge slowly, the way it always did, not arriving so much as gradually replacing what had been there before. By the first week of April, the snow was gone from the south-facing slopes, and the mud season was in full operation, and the ridge trails were soft and smelled like wet earth and possibility. The east addition to the barn had its frame up. The community space was taking shape. On the Saturday morning, when they poured the concrete floor for the East End Owens crew, Daniel and Clara, with Lily keeping records in a notebook she designated for the purpose, Daniel found himself standing in the not-yet-finished space and understanding something clearly. He'd built things for most of his adult life. He'd built things for other people and watched them become parts of other people's lives. He'd repaired things that would have been lost. He'd said times noto, things that couldn't be saved, and times yesto, things that could be. And he'd carried that work home with him every night and set it down in the morning when he went out again. He'd done all of that with skill and honesty and care. He'd done it alone, mostly. He'd thought of alone as the natural state of things. The floor was curing. Owen and his crew had gone to lunch. Lily was in the barn proper, checking on Cleo and Frost with the seriousness of someone who takes her responsibilities seriously. Clara was outside on the phone, standing in the pale April sun with her free hand in her jacket pocket and he could see her through the half-framed wall, and he noticed the exact angle of the light and the way it landed on her, and he let himself notice it without looking away. She came back in a few minutes. She looked at the floor, then at him. "The bank confirmed the extension is formalized," she said. "We're clear for 12 months. Good." She nodded. She looked around at the framed walls, the bare concrete, the light coming through the unfinished window openings. "My father would have." She stopped, tried again. "He would have really liked this." "I know," Daniel said. She looked at him, and a moment passed between them, and she smiled, and the smile had grief in it and gratitude, and something simpler underneath both of those, the expression of someone who is exactly where they decided to be. "Daniel," she said. "Yeah." And then, lightly, with the ease of someone asking a question they already know the answer to, "Are you married?" He looked at her for a moment. He looked toward the barn, where he could hear Lily talking to the gray gelding in the patient. Low voice she used with things she wanted to trust her. He looked back at Clara. "No," he said, "but I've been thinking that it might be time to change that." She held his gaze. "Have you?" "I have." Outside, a bird started up somewhere on the ridge, the first one he'd heard this year, clear and purposeful in the April air. The concrete floor was pale, gray, and even and solid. The light came through the open walls and made the whole space luminous. Clara took a step toward him, and he let her close the distance. And the question asked twice now, answered twice, both times imperfectly, and both times honestly hung in the warm spring air between them, and gradually became something else. Something that didn't need a name yet. Something that seemed, for the first time in a long time, like it was built to last.